piece of junk off my road! I just want to see your face when you find out who you're dealing with.
Today was supposed to be the most perfect day of my life. It was our very first date. I had spent the entire week preparing for this exact moment. I scrubbed the old family log homestead until my shoulders ached, and the raw timber beams breathed a rich, clean scent of lemon oil, beeswax, and aged pine. I had gone down to the local butcher in town on Thursday evening, picking out the thickest, most beautifully marbled ribeye steaks he had in his cold room wrapped in brown butcher paper. I swept the wide wooden porch twice, once in the cool of the morning, and again just as the sun climbed over the eastern ridge, watching the fine gray dust motes dance in the shafts of late morning light before they settled back into the deep, weather-beaten cracks of the 120-year-old pine boards. I was just waiting for the low, rhythmic rumble of Valerie's Ford Bronco to echo around the sharp bend of the forested canyon. I wanted so desperately to prove to her that beneath the rough, grease-caked exterior of a quiet mechanic, I could offer her a sanctuary. A peaceful weekend, entirely insulated from the deafening, frantic grind of the industrial world she managed. Instead, the shrill electronic shriek of a megaphone pierced the clean morning air, brutal and precise as a blade slicing our quiet pocket of the thunglung to ribbons. It was a sharp, feedback-laden wail that bounced off the weathered timber of my barn, rattled the zinc buckets hanging by the water pump, and caused my hands to freeze midair. I was holding a clean, dry rag, trying to wipe the last stubborn crescents of black grease from under my fingernails, a futile morning ritual before she arrived. My skin was raw from the stiff, bristled brush, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, the dark crescent remained the permanent signature of a man who spent his life coaxing ancient iron back to life. Now my ears rang, my chest tightened with a hot, sickeningly familiar dread, and my face burned with a sudden, humiliating flush of hot embarrassment. Of all the days for the Homeowners Association circus to roll into my yard, it had to be today. It had to be the first time Valerie came to visit my home. Attention, you are in direct violation of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Covenant Section 12.4. Cease and desist all unauthorized transit immediately. Victoria Montgomery was already halfway down the gravel slope that led from the paved boundary of the development to my private driveway. Her pristine cream-colored silk pantsuit contrasted violently with the rugged, dusty Montana dirt beneath her heels. She walked with the deliberate heel-first stride of a monarch, marching down to crush a peasant rebellion in some far-off, unruly province. Her platinum blonde hair lacquered into a rigid aerodynamic helmet that completely defied the mountain breeze. In her manicured hands, she held a heavy leather clipboard like a scepter, using a gold-plated designer pen to point accusingly at Valerie's muddy Bronco. To her left and right, the pine trees of the valley seemed to withdraw their branches as if trying to distance themselves from the sheer concentrated hostility marching down the hill. Behind her marched two young men in tight black polyester polo shirts with Whispering Pines security embroidered in gold thread across their chests. Their utility belts were heavily laden with oversized flashlights, plastic zip ties, and a profound sense of unearned authority. They walked with their elbows flared out as if their muscles were too large to allow their arms to hang naturally. Beside Victoria strode Deputy Vance, a local county sheriff's deputy, whose uniform looked slightly too tight around his midsection and whose eyes always seemed to linger on the prominent gold logo embossed on Victoria's clipboard. It was common knowledge in the county that the HOA paid for the sheriff's department's new patrol vehicles. Vance was merely the physical manifestation of that transactional justice. I stepped off my porch, the old wooden boards creaking under my boots like a collective groan of protest from my ancestors. "Victoria, what is the meaning of this?" I said, trying desperately to keep my voice low and steady, though I couldn't hide the tight constriction of rage in my chest. "This is my family's private property. You have no right to march your security force down here with a megaphone. We are not under your jurisdiction, and we are certainly not subject to your neighborhood rules. Your property ends where the Whispering Pines scenic corridor begins." "Wyatt," Victoria declared through her megaphone, her voice amplified until it rattled the dry needles on the surrounding ponderosa pines. She clicked her designer pen with a sharp metallic snap that sounded like a miniature pistol shot. "Under HOA Regulation 14B, any unauthorized, unwashed, and visually offensive vehicle parked on or within 50 feet of our residential easement is subject to an immediate $5,000 fine and immediate impoundment. We do not tolerate visual pollutants that drag down the property values of our members. Whispering Pines is a premium development, and we have a legal obligation to maintain our aesthetic standards." She pointed the pen directly at the green 1990 Ford Bronco parked next to my barn. The vehicle was caked in the thick, dry gray mud of the high logging trails, its forest green paint faded by years of mountain sun. It had a slight rhythmic drip of water coming from the AC condenser, pooling harmlessly in the dry gravel. To me, it was a beautiful machine of rugged, unapologetic utility, a vehicle that had conquered the mountain passes without asking for permission. To Victoria, it was an aesthetic war crime, an unsightly blemish on the sterile beige and sand canvas she had spent 3 years painting over the valley. "This is not an abandoned vehicle, and it's not on your easement," I yelled, my voice rising, fighting against the suffocating tightness in my chest. I wasn't afraid of Victoria, but I was terrified that Valerie would look at me and see a weak, helpless man who couldn't even protect his girlfriend's car on their very first date. "This belongs to my guest. She just arrived. We are on my family's land, which my grandfather homesteaded in 1906. Your developers built your road around my access, not the other way around. I have a recorded right-of-way that predates your entire subdivision by nearly a century. The historic easement was granted strictly for agricultural use." "Wyatt," Victoria said, her tone dripping with the patient, icy condescension one reserves for an exceptionally stubborn child. "This unsanitary contraption is not agricultural. It is an environmental hazard. Look at that mud. It's dripping onto our scenic corridor. It's a visual pollutant. Property values in Whispering Pines do not tolerate the presence of demolition derby rejects. We have an aesthetic harmony to maintain, and we will not have our prospective buyers deterred by the sight of backyard mechanical ruins. Deputy Vance, if you please." "Execute the order." "Wyatt, she's got the paperwork," Deputy Vance said, stepping forward, clearing his throat and resting his heavy hand on his utility belt just above his taser. He looked at me with a mixture of bureaucratic indifference and slight local embarrassment, but his loyalty lay firmly with the hand that signed the county budget. "The county commission signed off on the scenic corridor designation last month. If the vehicle doesn't have an official HOA registered permit decal, it's considered an abandoned obstruction. It's got to go. I'm authorized to oversee the tow." Before I could reply, the low, throaty whine of a diesel engine signaled the descent of a flatbed tow truck from the paved crest of the hill. It was an aggressive, black-painted truck with Apex Towing and Recovery emblazoned across the side in jagged neon yellow letters. The truck was driven by Brad Miller, Victoria's cousin, a man who made his living patrolling the Whispering Pines visitor lots like a hungry shark in a shallow cove, towing cars for minor infractions and charging exorbitant retrieval fees that were quietly split with the HOA management. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my fists clenching so hard my fingernails bit into my palms. I was ready to step between the tow truck and the Bronco, ready to take a taser strike from Vance, ready to get arrested right here on my own dirt if it meant stopping them from stealing her car. I looked back toward the porch, expecting to see Valerie looking panicked, or perhaps crying, or looking at me with the deep disappointment of a woman whose date had just collapsed into a bureaucratic nightmare. But what I saw froze me in my tracks. Valerie Knight was standing quietly, leaning her back against the weathered wooden porch railing, holding the heavy ceramic mug of black coffee I had just brewed for her. She wasn't panicked. In fact, her face didn't show a single trace of anger, fear, or distress. Not a single muscle in her jaw was clenched. Instead, she was watching the black tow truck back down my driveway with an incredibly calm, almost analytical gaze. The cool intellectual fascination of an engineer observing a minor, predictable laboratory experiment. She booked down the porch steps, her movements unhurried, almost lazy. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, heavy silver coin, a challenge coin bearing the high-relief emblem of an industrial heavy-haul transporter, and began rolling it slowly and smoothly over her knuckles. "Don't apologize, Wyatt," Valerie said softly. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying an even conversational tone that felt entirely surreal amidst the screaming megaphone and clanking chains. She looked past Victoria up the paved hill toward the massive multi-million-dollar limestone gate structure that stood like a medieval fortress wall between my land and the state highway. The gate was hand-carved from Indiana limestone, featuring pillars 6 feet thick, topped by a heavy decorative steel archway that proudly displayed the words Whispering Pines in elegant gold leaf serif. "It's actually quite impressive," Valerie whispered, her eyes tracing the masonry. "That gate, it's solid limestone, isn't it?" "Hand-carved," Victoria Montgomery interjected, her voice rising with a smug missionary pride. as she stepped closer, clearly mistaking Valerie's calm curiosity for awe. Designed by an award-winning architect from Seattle to evoke a sense of timeless European heritage, it is the physical manifestation of our community's high standards. Standards that do not include rusted trucks, grease-stained yards, and transient visitors. 2.5 million. Valerie murmured, her eyes tracing the thick stone pillars and the heavy steel lintel that spanned the top of the gate, connecting the two massive pillars. And it sits right on the throat of the county road access. It sits exactly where it belongs, Victoria snapped. And now, Brad, bring the truck down. Brad backed the flatbed tow truck directly into my driveway, the hydraulic bed tilting downward with a metallic screech that set my teeth on edge. He jumped out of the cab carrying a set of heavy steel J-hooks and chains, walking toward Valerie's Bronco with a grin of pure bureaucratic malice. "You aren't touching her car, Brad," I said, stepping between the tow truck and the Bronco, my body trembling with a mixture of rage and shame. "I'll drive it into my barn right now. It's my land. You have no legal right to tow a vehicle from my private driveway." "The tow truck is already on the easement, Wyatt," Deputy Vance said, stepping in to block my path, his chest puffed out. "If you interfere, I'll have to arrest you for obstruction of justice. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I was about to throw a punch regardless of the consequences when Valerie laid a hand gently on my forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm, cool, and incredibly steadying. It was like a sudden splash of cold water that instantly put out the fire burning in my chest. I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Her eyes were deep calm and carrying a strange, almost imperceptible spark of absolute amusement. "Let them, Wyatt," she said softly. "Valerie, no. Really, it's fine," she said, her eyes locked on Victoria Montgomery, who was watching the scene with a smug, victorious smile. "Let them tow it. I'd hate to stand in the way of timeless European heritage." I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. I couldn't comprehend how a woman could watch her beloved truck being chained and dragged away on our very first date without shedding a tear or throwing a fit. Her calmness didn't feel like the submission of the weak. It felt like the quiet, calculated authority of someone who knew exactly what cards she was holding, someone who knew she was about to completely rebuild the board. She pulled her phone from her pocket, a rugged military-grade satellite device encased in thick olive drab rubber that looked entirely out of place in her dirt-smudged hands, and stepped back toward the porch. "They're going to tow it to the Apex yard in town, Valerie," I whispered, my voice cracking with frustration. "It's a scam. They charge $800 just for the hookup, and Victoria gets a kickback. I've seen them do it to 3 other neighbors who wouldn't sign their easement over." "I know," Valerie said, her voice carrying a strange rhythmic cadence as she began typing on her screen. "But sometimes, Wyatt, to understand the structural integrity of a system, you have to let it load. You have to see where the stress points are." She tapped her screen, placed the phone to her ear, and spoke 3 words into the receiver with a tone of voice that was quiet, flat, but carried the absolute weight of a command that could not be revoked. "Activate Corridor 9. The afternoon light in the valley did not fade so much as it was squeezed out by the massive cold shadow of the Whispering Pines gate. As the flatbed tow truck groaned its way back up the hill, Valerie's beloved green Bronco chained to its deck like a captured beast. I sat on my porch steps, my head in my hands. I felt small. I felt the crushing weight of modern money, the kind of money that could buy county commissioners, hire off-duty deputies, and rewrite the geography of a valley that my family had worked with plow and sweat for over a century. The quiet of the thunglung felt heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional distant sharp pop of a golf ball from the newly completed 3rd hole of the Whispering Pines Country Club, just over the ridge. "I had a whole dinner planned," I said to the dirt between my boots, my voice hollowed out by the sheer exhausting futility of my daily struggle. "Ribeyes from the local butcher in town. I was going to show you the old steam tractor my grandfather bought in '48. I wanted you to see why I stay here, why this dirt matters. Instead, you had to watch my neighbor steal your car with a badge-wearing referee." Valerie walked over, carrying 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee she had brewed in my kitchen. She didn't sit on the steps. She leaned against the wooden porch railing, her eyes fixed on the limestone gate at the top of the hill, watching the light catch the carved letters that spelled out Whispering Pines in elegant gold-leaf serif. She seemed entirely unbothered by the loss of her vehicle, her expression calm, contemplative, and focused on something far beyond the immediate horizon. She looked at the gate with a quiet intensity, as if she were assessing not just its physical dimensions, but the entire weight of the arrogance that had built it. The interior of the barn was a temple of silent history. The air was cool, smelling of linseed oil, grease, coal, soot, and dried sweetgrass from the upper loft. The Case 110 stood in the center like a sleeping behemoth, its dark iron skin holding the chill of the previous night. I pointed out the heavy brass grease cups on the main crankshaft bearings, each one hand-polished to a dull gold gleam. Valerie leaned in her hair, slipping forward, smelling faintly of copper and pine needles, completely unbothered by the dust that settled on her red flannel shirt. "This flywheel," she murmured, her fingers lightly tapping the massive 6-foot-wide cast-iron wheel that balanced the massive double-acting single-cylinder steam engine. "It's perfectly balanced. You could turn this entire 40-ton machine over with one hand if the cylinder is hot and the packing gland is tight." That's what people don't get about these old machines, Wyatt. They weren't just big, they were balanced. Modern engines rely on high-speed rotation and cheap materials to generate power. They scream under the hood. But these steam giants, they deliver maximum torque at 0 RPM. They don't scream, they just lean into the load and breathe. It's a beautiful, patient way to move the world. We stood there for a long time, side by side, just looking at the steel cleats of the rear wheels. Each cleat was a thick diagonal bar of iron designed to bite into the soft mountain soil of the thunglung and hold fast, converting 80 horsepower of drawbar pull into pure, unstoppable forward momentum. My grandfather had told me that when this machine was running under full load, the ground would tremble for 100 yards in every direction, not with a chaotic shake, but with a deep, steady heartbeat that resonated with the bedrock itself. Valerie began to tell me about her father's early days in the 1970s, back when he had nothing but a surplus military tank retriever truck and a toolbox. "I was a quiet man," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, reminiscent tone. "He didn't talk much in meetings. He'd just sit there with his pocket knife carving a small block of cedar wood, while the corporate lawyers and county commissioners screamed at each other about permits and liability. And then when everyone was exhausted, he'd slide his wood carvings across the table. They'd be perfectly shaped wedges, showing them exactly where the structural load would distribute on the bridge or the barge. He'd look at them and say, 'Gentlemen, the water doesn't care about your county boundaries, and the steel doesn't care about your contracts. It only cares about the weight. And if we don't distribute the weight, we all go under.' They'd usually sign the papers after that. He had this way of making the loudest people in the room feel incredibly light because they realized they were arguing about paper, and he was working with gravity." I listened to her, my chest swelling with a feeling I hadn't felt in 3 years. For so long I had felt entirely isolated, a lone holdout in a thunglung that had been colonized by sterile beige mansions and people who looked at my livelihood as an eyesore. I had spent countless nights lying awake in my bed, listening to the hum of the subdivision's irrigation pumps and wondering if I was just a fool clinging to a dead past. But standing next to Valerie, looking at the hand-riveted steel of the Case 110, I realized that my grandfather's legacy wasn't dead scrap metal. It was a foundation. And foundations were built to support real weight, not just aesthetic facades. "Wyatt," she said, handing me a mug, "your grandfather's steam tractor. It's a Case 110, isn't it? Because there are only about a dozen of them left in running condition in North America," she said, taking a slow sip of her coffee, the steam rising to meet her face in the cool mountain air. "And because I know the boiler specs on a 1912 Case by heart. My father used to keep a blueprint of one in his study. He said it was the finest example of American heavy engineering ever built. He called it the locomotive that didn't need tracks. He loved the idea of a machine that carried its own road with it, a machine built to move the impossible through sheer unyielding force. It taught me that true power doesn't scream or wave a clipboard. It hums at a low frequency and distributes its weight so perfectly that the earth doesn't even feel the strain. It doesn't need to assert its dominance because its presence is undeniable." I felt a strange sudden shift in the air. The embarrassment that had weighed down my chest began to evaporate, replaced by a growing quiet awe. "Your father, what did he do?" "He moved things," Valerie said simply, "and now I move them." "Come," I said, standing up, "let me show you." We walked in silence toward the wide double doors of the timber barn. I pulled the heavy iron latch and the doors creaked open, revealing a cavern of cool, shadow-filled air smelling of pine shavings, grease, and old coal dust. In the center of the floor sat a mountain of dark, oil-rubbed iron. It was the Case 110, Its massive rear wheels, over 6 feet tall and wrapped in deep, aggressive steel cleats, looked like the gears of some ancient titan. The boiler was a long black cylinder wrapped in sheet metal jacketing that had been polished until it gleamed like obsidian. Valerie stepped closer, her eyes wide with a reverence that I had never seen in anyone else. She reached out her hand, her fingers tracing the heavy rivets that ran along the boiler seam. "Look at this boiler," she whispered, her voice echoing softly in the rafters of the barn. "It's a hand-riveted lap seam, tested to 150 pounds of working pressure. You can see where the Boilermaker's hammer struck the iron over a century ago. They didn't have X-rays or ultrasonic testing back then, Wyatt. They relied on the ring of the steel under the hammer. If it sang true, it was safe. It's a machine built on faith and human skill. My grandfather used to plow 30 acres a day with it." I said, my eyes tracing the heavy steering chain that connected the front axle to the worm gear steering shaft. "He said the engine didn't care about the grade of the hill. If the cleats could grip the dirt, the boiler would pull it. He called it the iron horse of the valley. When the local mining companies needed to haul heavy boilers over the high passes, they didn't use horses or mules. They came and hired my grandfather in this case. They knew that steam didn't tire and iron didn't bleed. My father started his company with a single surplus military truck in 1974. Valerie said, her voice drifting back in time. "I was hired to move an entire historic church across a river in Maine. The local engineer said it was impossible, that the bridge would collapse and the timber would splinter. But my father understood the geometry of load distribution. He spent 3 weeks calculating the exact placement of every hydraulic jack, every steel beam, and every woodblock. When they finally moved it, the church didn't even creak. The water in the baptismal font didn't even spill. He taught me that there is no load too heavy for the earth to bear, as long as you understand how to spread the weight." She turned back to me, her expression turning serious. "But Victoria and her HOA board don't want honesty. They want a pristine simulated reality. They want a landscape that looks like a watercolor painting, but has the structural integrity of a cardboard box. They look at this machine and see scrap metal because they don't understand the physics of life. They don't know that without the iron and coal that built this country, their little sand-colored castles wouldn't even exist." She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the map application, holding it out to me. On the screen was the highly detailed multi-layered geographic survey map showing the Federal Heavy Haul Corridor 9. "That purple line," Valerie explained, her finger tracing the path that sliced through the very center of the Whispering Pines development, "is an active strategic artery. The developers of Whispering Pines tried to ignore it. They thought that because they had the county commissioners in their pocket, they could build over federal easements. They assumed the world would bend to their aesthetic standards." I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to connect the grand legal terms with the dusty track I drove every day. But what are they moving? What requires a corridor like this? Right now in Washington State, at the decommissioned Hanford nuclear site, there is a 380-ton steam generator that needs to be transported to a research facility in North Dakota, Valerie said. "It's too heavy for rail and too wide for the interstate tunnels. The only way is overland through the mountain passes. And the only route that can support the weight is Corridor 9. My family's company, Knight Heavy Haul, has been planning this transport for over a year. We've surveyed every bridge, every grade, every clearance." She looked up at the hill where the limestone gate stood like a medieval fortress. "We had originally scheduled the route through the Southern Pass, but this morning after Victoria had my Bronco towed, I realized the Southern Pass has a bridge under repair that might be a bit too tight. So I had Mark Harrison file an emergency road amendment with the Federal Highway Administration. As of 2 hours ago, Corridor 9 is the active transport route. The Federal Registry has been updated." I let out a breath that was half laugh, half gasp. "You rerouted a 380-ton nuclear steam generator because Victoria towed your Bronco." "No," Valerie corrected me, her voice soft but absolute. "I rerouted it because Victoria Montgomery believes that if you have enough money, you can build walls to lock out the rest of the world. She thinks her $2.5 million gate makes her the queen of this valley. I think she needs a lesson in federal sovereignty. She needs to understand that some lines cannot be redrawn by an HOA board." She reached out gently, tapping my dirt-smudged knuckle. "And besides," she added with a wink, "nobody touches my Bronco." Before the night fell, there was an hour of deep, perfect stillness in the high thung lung that my father had always called the crepuscular tide. It was that fleeting transition when the sun had dipped behind the rugged western peaks of the Madison Range, leaving the sky painted in a vast, quiet gradient of burnt orange, dusty lavender, and the deep, cold blue of the oncoming night. In this hour, the pine forest seemed to hold its collective breath. The constant dry whisper of the wind through the needles would settle into a complete hush, and the only sound would be the occasional chuckle of the creek over the limestone rocks or the sharp, distant call of a solitary nighthawk hunting above the timberline. Valerie and I sat on the porch steps during this hour, our warm mugs of coffee cradled between our palms. The heat from the ceramic felt good against the crisp, dry air that was beginning to pool in the bottom of the valley. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was an ease in her presence that I had never experienced with anyone else. With most people, silence felt like a void that needed to be filled with nervous laughter or polite small talk. But with Valerie, silence was a physical space. We shared a quiet agreement that the world around us was fascinating enough without our commentary. I watched her profile against the fading twilight. Her gaze was fixed on the ridge where the Whispering Pines subdivision sat, its brand new streetlights beginning to flicker on, one by one, in their pre-programmed energy-efficient intervals. They looked like a line of cold, sterile stars completely disconnected from the natural rhythms of the Thunglung. "They think they've tamed it," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper, yet holding a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the cool air. "They think that because they've laid down asphalt-built concrete retaining walls and planted sod that doesn't belong here, they've claimed this place. But they don't see the water table beneath them. They don't see the ancient fault lines that run through this granite. They don't understand that the earth has a way of sliding, shifting, and settling. You can build a house on a hill, Wyatt, but if you don't anchor it to the bedrock, the mountain will eventually take it back." "My father always said the same thing," I replied, staring down at my boots. "He told me that the Thunglung would tolerate us as long as we worked with it, not against it. That's why he built the homestead using local timber, why he left the natural drainage channels untouched, and why he refused to sell the road rights. He knew that some lines on a map are drawn with ink and others are carved by gravity. And ink always fades before gravity does." She turned her head to look at me, her dark eyes catching the last faint glow of the western sky. "Your father was a wise man, Wyatt, and you are a good guardian of his legacy. Don't let Victoria and her board make you feel small. They are operating on a lease of temporary illusion. Their world is built on credit marketing and the fragile promises of county zoning boards. But our world is built on iron coal and the unyielding geometry of structural weight. And that is a foundation that doesn't buckle." Her hand slipped off her knee and rested over mine. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm and filled with an absolute, unquestioned certainty. In that moment, the lingering shame that had weighed down my shoulders all day evaporated completely. I realized that the battle I was fighting wasn't just about a driveway or an HOA permit. It was a battle for the soul of the valley, a choice between a sterile, simulated paradise and the raw, heavy reality of the land itself. And with Valerie standing beside me, I knew I was no longer fighting alone. By 11:30 p.m., the Whispering Pines subdivision was asleep. The multi-million-dollar homes stood like dark, silent monoliths under the Montana stars, their lawns irrigated to a perfect uniform green, their manicured gardens smelling of imported cedar mulch. The residents of Whispering Pines slept with the deep, uninterrupted security of the wealthy, cocooned in double-paned glass air filtration systems, and the comforting knowledge that their HOA fees paid for off-duty sheriff's deputies to keep the reality of the world at bay. The silence of Whispering Pines before the convoy arrived was the fragile, expensive silence of a museum after hours. Every lawn sprinkler had completed its programmed rotation, leaving the manicured sod glistening with chemically treated water. The streetlights, painted a uniform matte bronze to match the subdivision's aesthetic guidelines, cast a warm, soft glow on the empty asphalt. In her master bedroom, Victoria Montgomery lay under a $3,000 Egyptian cotton duvet, her breathing slow and shallow. She had spent her afternoon writing a detailed letter of reprimand to a homeowner 3 streets over whose children had left a red plastic tricycle on their driveway for more than 2 hours after sunset, which she claimed had violated the subdivision's visual harmony and safety guidelines. Her world was a world of absolute, unquestioned order, a world where the messiness of life could be entirely managed by a well-written covenant and a cooperative county deputy. But gravity has a way of asserting itself no matter how much you pay to keep it away. The first tremor was almost spiritual. It began deep in the granite bedrock of the Thunglung miles below the pristine asphalt. It was a low-frequency hum that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the chest cavity, a deep thrum, thrum, thrum that felt like the purr of a sleeping titan. In the kitchen of my homestead, the tin cups hanging on the cedar wall began to vibrate, sending tiny metallic whispers into the dark room. I looked out the window. The sky over the mountain pass was glowing with a pale, rhythmic amber light. It looked like the horizon was caught in a slow, silent electrical storm, the flashing beacon lights of the lead escort vehicles reflecting off the low-hanging mountain clouds. "They're descending the pass." Valerie said, her voice steady as she stood beside me, her leather jacket zipped tight against the cold wind that always swept down the canyon at midnight. She was checking her satellite screen, watching the real-time telemetry of the Nicholas platform trailer. "The crew is running the hydraulic suspension at full pressure to keep the generator level on the 8% grade. Mark has the rear prime mover operating in retarder braking mode. They're moving at exactly 3 miles an hour. It's a slow walk, Wyatt, but once 1,000,000 pounds of steel starts moving down a mountain, it doesn't stop for anything short of a rock slide." As the convoy crested the final hill, the true scale of the machine became visible. The two Oshkosh M170 prime movers were beasts of war designed to pull 80-ton battle tanks through desert sand. Their massive specialized Michelin tires were over 5 feet tall, their exhaust stacks rising like pillars of black iron, coughing thick, heavy plumes of diesel smoke that smudged the clean, starry sky. The Nicholas trailer behind them was a masterpiece of hydraulic complexity. It was a wide, flat deck supported by 96 independent wheels, each set of wheels mounted on an axle that could pivot, raise, or lower in response to the computer-controlled hydraulic system. It moved with an eerie, caterpillar-like motion, the entire platform remaining perfectly level, even as the individual wheels crawled over the rough, uneven gravel of my driveway. On top of the trailer sat the steam generator, a massive cylindrical steel sarcophagus draped in heavy industrial tarps. It was a silent, heavy giant containing the steel bones of an era of nuclear power, moving through our quiet Montana thunglung like a visiting god from an age of machines. In her master bedroom, Victoria Montgomery was sleeping the sleep of the righteous. Her clipboard sat on her nightstand next to a glass of sparkling water and a draft of the new HOA regulation she intended to introduce on Monday, a regulation that would outlaw any vehicle older than 5 years from entering the valley entirely. Suddenly, a low subsonic vibration began to hum through the floorboards. It was not a sound at first. It was a pressure in the ears, a subtle rattling of the window panes, a rhythmic, deep-seated pulse that shook the water in Victoria's glass. In my homestead, I felt it too. I stood on my porch, his jacket zipped tight against the night chill. Beside me, Valerie stood with her hands in her pockets, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of her satellite phone. "They're coming over the pass," Valerie said, her voice quiet but filled with anticipation. "How big is it?" I asked, looking up the dark road. "The generator itself is 380 tons, Valerie said, her eyes fixed on the distant ridge. "But the transporter, that's a different story. It's a Nicholas heavy-duty hydraulic platform trailer. 2 parallel lines of 24 axles each, 96 wheels in total. It's powered by 2 primary prime movers, 800 horsepower Oshkosh M170, heavy tactical trucks, 1 pulling, 1 pushing. Total gross vehicle weight is just over 1.2 million pounds. It's not a truck, Wyatt. It's a landship. It's a machine designed to move mountains. And it is completely indifferent to the delicate sensibilities of suburbia. 1.2 million pounds. I repeated, my mind struggling to grasp the scale of the machinery moving through my quiet valley. At the top of the hill, the automated wrought iron gates of Whispering Pines began to rattle. Down the paved street of the subdivision, the streetlights began to flicker. Cursory yellow hazard lights began to flash on the horizon, casting long, sweeping shadows through the pine trees. Then came the sound. It was a deafening metallic roar, the combined grunt of 2 massive military-grade V12 diesel engines crawling in low gear, their exhaust stacks coughing thick plumes of black smoke into the clean mountain air. Victoria Montgomery bolted upright in bed. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. The floorboards were vibrating so violently that her nightstand was sliding across the hardwood floor. The water in her glass was no longer merely shaking. It was jumping, sending tiny rhythmic concentric rings to the edge of the crystal. She threw off her duvet, rushed to her window, and gasped. Down the main access road of Whispering Pines, a convoy of flashing amber lights was slowly descending. It looked like a military invasion. There were police cruisers from the State Highway Patrol, utility trucks, with cherry pickers and massive black painted support vehicles bearing the yellow and black logo of Knight Infrastructure Group. And in the center of the convoy was a mountain of steel. The Nicholas trailer was wider than the entire paved two-lane road. Its 96 wheels crawled with a slow, caterpillar-like motion, each hydraulic axle adjusting independently to the crown and dip of the asphalt. On top of the trailer sat the decommissioned steam generator, a massive cylindrical steel sarcophagus draped in heavy industrial tarps and secured by hundreds of high-tensile steel cables. As the convoy approached the $2.5 million limestone gate, the lead Oshkosh truck came to a halt. Its air brakes released with a loud explosive hiss that echoed through the valley like a gunshot. Victoria Montgomery, now wearing a silk robe and a pair of frantic slippers, came running down her manicured lawn. She was joined by half a dozen other HOA board members, all of them rubbing their eyes and shouting in confusion. Deputy Vance's patrol car was already parked near the gate, its blue and red lights flashing uselessly against the massive wall of the Oshkosh truck. The scene at the gate looked like a clash of two entirely different civilizations. On one side stood the residents of Whispering Pines, clad in designer pajamas, silk robes, and plush slippers, looking like refugees from a high-end spa. On the other side stood the heavy transport crew, men and women in high-visibility jackets, steel-toed boots, and hard hats, their faces smudged with diesel soot and grease. The scene at the limestone gate was a pure theatrical performance. Victoria Montgomery stood in her silk robe, her hands shaking as she pointed her manicured finger at the towering steel grille of the lead Oshkosh truck. The truck's massive diesel engine was idling with a deep, earth-shaking thrum, thrum, thrum that made the silk of her pajamas vibrate against her skin. "Deputy Vance!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. "This is a private road. They are destroying our brand new asphalt. The developer guaranteed us that this road was built for residential use only. Arrest them. This is a criminal trespass." Deputy Vance stepped forward, but his boots felt heavy on the gravel. He was used to enforcing HOA parking rules and writing warning notices for overgrown weeds. "I was not prepared to face a convoy of federal marshals and a multi-million-dollar heavy-haul transport crew." Before he could even reach for his duty belt, the door of the leading black Suburban popped open. Federal Marshal Miller stepped out, his tall, broad-supported frame clad in a dark tactical jacket that bore the gold emblem of the United States Marshal Service. I didn't look angry. He looked exceptionally tired, with the deep, patient fatigue of a man who spent his life enforcing federal law in places that thought they were above it. He walked directly up to Deputy Vance, his eyes locking onto the deputy's badge. Deputy Miller said, his voice flat, quiet, and absolutely immovable. "I suggest you instruct your local security staff to step back. This transport is operating under a Department of Energy emergency clearance order signed by the Federal Highway Administration. Under Title 49, Section 403 of the United States Code, any physical obstruction of this corridor is a federal offense. If you or anyone else attempts to interfere with this convoy, I will arrest you on the spot for obstruction of justice. Do I make myself clear?" Deputy Vance looked at the marshal's gold badge, then up at the towering matte black steel bumper of the Oshkosh truck, and slowly took a long step back. He cleared his throat, turned his back to Victoria, and whispered, "Victoria, my hands are tied. This is federal business." "Your hands are tied," Victoria gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "We pay for your patrol cars, Vance. We pay the county. This gate cost our members $2.5 million. You can't let them destroy it." "I can," Valerie Knight said, stepping through the crowd of whispering residents. She looked incredibly steady, her hands in her leather jacket pockets, her hair pulled back by the brass cotter pin that caught the flashing amber lights of the utility trucks. She stood in front of the massive stone pillar, looking up at the hand-carved Indiana limestone with a faint clinical smile. "You wanted to play with rules and boundaries, Victoria. You spent 3 years trying to rewrite the geography of this thunglung to lock out the people who actually work the land. You thought your money could buy you a private kingdom. But you forgot that the bones of this country are made of steel and concrete, and they are protected by laws that don't care about your HOA covenants. You thought you could use county budget favors to rewrite federal sovereignty." She turned to Mark Harrison, her chief of operations. "Mark, bring the heavy shears up. Let's clear the corridor." "Yes, ma'am," Mark said, turning to his radio. "Bring the rotators up. We have a physical bottleneck at coordinate 9. Clear the span." The two massive yellow excavators, equipped with hydraulic demolition shears that could cut through 12-inch steel beams like butter, crawled forward on their heavy steel tracks. The clanking of their tracks was a slow, rhythmic march of doom for the beautiful, expensive limestone gate. The crew worked with the silent, efficient speed of a military combat engineering unit. They threw heavy steel cables around the decorative archway, securing them to the hydraulic booms of the excavators. The engines of the excavators roared to life, their hydraulic systems building up thousands of pounds of pressure. The cables tightened, singing with a high-pitched metallic hum that set my teeth on edge. Crack! The central steel lintel buckled the elegant gold-leaf letters of Whispering Pines, twisting and splitting as the entire steel archway was ripped from its stone foundations. It crashed onto the asphalt with a deafening metallic thud, sending a spectacular shower of orange sparks into the night air. The residents gasped, several of them covering their faces in horror as their symbol of exclusive luxury was crushed into the dirt. The hydraulic hammers of the excavators began to strike the solid stone pillars. The 6-foot-thick hand-carved Indiana limestone, designed to evoke a sense of timeless European heritage, crumbled under the relentless rhythmic pounding of the steel chisels. Massive blocks of stone shattered, sending clouds of white powdery dust billowing into the air, settling over Victoria's cream silk pantsuit and frantic slippers like a heavy cold winter snow. Within 10 minutes, the $2.5 million gate was nothing but a neat pile of white rubble pushed to the side of the road by a yellow bulldozer. The corridor was clear. The lead Oshkosh truck released its air brakes with a loud, triumphant hiss, its massive V12 engine roaring as it smoothly rolled through the newly cleared 24-foot gap. Behind it, the 96 wheels of the Nicholas trailer crawled majestically over the white limestone dust, carrying the 380-ton nuclear steam generator through the ruins of Whispering Pines. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria screamed, her voice cracking as she confronted a massive man in a hard hat who had just stepped down from the lead Oshkosh truck. "This is private property. You are trespassing. You cannot bring this monstrosity through our neighborhood. Deputy Vance, arrest them." Deputy Vance stepped forward, but before he could draw his taser, 2 black Suburbans with government plates came to a silent halt behind his patrol car. 4 men in dark tactical gear with Federal Marshal embroidered across their chests stepped out. One of them, a tall officer with a grim expression, walked directly up to Vance. "Deputy," the federal officer said, showing his gold badge. "Federal Marshal Miller, this transport is operating under a Federal Highway Administration emergency movement order. Any interference with this convoy constitutes a federal felony under Title 49. Step back and instruct your local security to do the same." Vance's face went pale. He looked at the badge, then at the massive Oshkosh truck, and slowly took his hand off his utility belt. He stepped back, leaving Victoria standing entirely alone. "This is ridiculous," Victoria hissed, her fingers clenching into her silk robe. "Our gate costs $2.5 million. Your truck cannot fit through there. The steel archway is only 20 feet wide." "I know," a cool, steady voice said from the darkness. Victoria spun around to see Valerie Knight splaying through the crowd. She had changed into a clean leather jacket over her flannel shirt, her dark hair still held by the brass cotter pin. Beside her, I walked, my heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and sheer, unadulterated anticipation. "Who are you?" Victoria demanded. "And what is your junk truck doing in our valley?" Mark Harrison, the director of operations for Knight Heavy Haul, walked up and stood beside Valerie, bowing his head with deep respect. "This is Valerie Knight, President and Chief Executive Officer of Knight Infrastructure Group. We are the federal contractors overseeing this transport." Victoria's jaw dropped. She looked from Valerie's mud-stained boots to her leather jacket, her brain struggling to process the fact that the transient visitor she had treated like garbage was the head of a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure empire. "You," Victoria whispered, her face draining of color. "You did this." "No." Valerie said, her voice quiet, conversational, and entirely devoid of anger. She rolled her silver challenge coin over her knuckles one last time and slipped it into her pocket. "You did this, Victoria, when you decided that your rules were higher than the laws of the country. When you built a solid stone gate across Federal Heavy Haul Corridor 9 without federal clearance. You loaded the system, and now the system is balancing itself." She turned to Mark Harrison. "Mark, what's the clearance?" "The Indiana limestone pillars are 20 feet apart, ma'am," Mark replied, checking his digital tablet. "The Nicholas trailer needs a minimum of 24 feet of clearance. The steel decorative archway is 21 feet high. The steam generator package is 23 feet tall. We cannot pass through without removing the structure." Is there a scheduled bypass? Valerie asked. No, ma'am. This is a designated emergency corridor. Under Title 49, Section 403, we are authorized to clear any unauthorized physical obstructions at the owner's expense. Excellent, Valerie said, turning back to Victoria with a calm, sweet smile. You paid $2.5 million for this gate, Victoria. I hope you kept the receipt. You can't do this, Victoria shrieked, stepping in front of the stone pillar. This is our heritage, our community. Step back, ma'am, Marshal Miller said gently but firmly, taking Victoria's arm and guiding her out of the way. Do not interfere with federal officers. Mark, Valerie said, her voice steady and absolute. Clear the corridor. Yes, ma'am. From the support convoy, two massive yellow excavators, equipped with hydraulic demolition shears and heavy steel cables, began to move forward. The crew worked with the silent, efficient precision of a military unit. They wrapped thick, high-tensile steel cables around the heavy decorative steel archway that proudly displayed the words, Whispering Pines. The excavators backed up the cables, tightening with a low singing hum. Snap. The steel lintel buckled, the elegant gold leaf letters twisting and tearing as the archway was ripped from its stone foundations with a deafening metallic screech. It crashed into the asphalt, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. The crew didn't pause. The hydraulic hammers of the excavators began to slam into the hand-carved Indiana limestone pillars. The 6-foot-thick stone, designed to evoke a sense of timeless European heritage, crumbled under the relentless rhythmic pounding of modern steel. Massive blocks of limestone shattered, sending clouds of white dust billowing into the air, settling over Victoria's manicured lawns and silk pajamas like a heavy winter snow. Within 10 minutes, the $2.5 million gate was nothing but a neat pile of rubble pushed to the side of the road by a yellow bulldozer. The lead Oshkosh truck roared to life, its V12 engine sending a tremor through the thunglung as it smoothly rolled through the newly cleared 24-foot corridor. Behind it, the 96 wheels of the Nicholas trailer crawled over the crushed limestone dust, the 380-ton steam generator passing majestically through the ruins of Whispering Pines. And right behind the generator, on the deck of a support flatbed, was Valerie's green Ford Bronco, completely unharmed, its mud-stained tires looking like badges of honor. Valerie turned to me, her hand sliding into mine. Her touch was warm, and she smiled with a gentle, quiet affection. I believe we have some ribeyes to grill Wyatt, and you were going to show me a steam tractor. The morning sun rose over the valley of Whispering Pines, casting long golden shadows through the ponderosa pines. The white dust of the shattered Indiana limestone still hung in the air, settling over the neat, sand-colored lawns of the subdivision like a quiet crystalline frost. At the entrance of the development, a crew of federal workers was already laying down heavy gravel to repair the road surface, their yellow dump trucks moving back and forth under the watchful eye of two federal marshals. Victoria Montgomery stood on her porch, her silk robe ruined her platinum hair, flat and gray with stone dust, watching her $2.5 million dream being hauled away in the back of a dump truck. Down at the old coal homestead, the air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dry pine. I stood in the wide doorway of the timber barn, shovel in hand, tossing coal into the firebox of the 1912 Case 110. Valerie stood beside me, her sleeves rolled up, her hands covered in a thin layer of grease as she adjusted the water injector valve. The fire inside the boiler crackled and roared, the draft drawing the heat through the tubes until the steam pressure gauge began to rise, its needle creeping past 80 pounds. Sing true. Valerie whispered, her hand resting on the boiler plate, listening to the rhythmic, deep-seated thrum of the steam pressure. She's singing true, Wyatt. I smiled, pulling the heavy chain of the brass steam whistle. A deafening, deep-throated roar erupted from the dome of the case. A sound so powerful, so heavy with the history of the land, that it shook the window panes of every faux craftsman mansion in Whispering Pines. It was a sound of iron, coal, and sweat, the voice of a valley that refused to be forgotten, a voice that carried its own road with it. Valerie looked at me, her eyes shining with a quiet, beautiful light, and I knew that the thunglung of Whispering Pines would never be the same again. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt entirely at home. The morning light continued to widen, painting the thunglung in shades of amber and rose. Valerie and I stood by the open barn doors, watching the wood smoke rise from the chimney of the old homestead, drifting lazy and gray against the deep green of the pine forest. We sat on the wooden bench we had built from reclaimed barn wood, holding our warm mugs, listening to the soft, rhythmic clanking of the federal dump trucks up on the ridge as they cleared the last pieces of the limestone gate. My father used to say that the land always wins in the end. Valerie said softly, her eyes following a hawk that was circling high above the timberline. We build our roads, we lay our concrete, we write our laws and covenants on paper, but the dirt beneath us. It has its own memory. It remembers the plow, the rain, the iron of the locomotives, and the sweat of the men who worked it. You can't cover that memory with a layer of sod and a $2 million gate. It's too heavy. It always breaks through. I looked down at our hands, mine still holding the dark crescent of grease beneath the nails, hers rough and marked with the small white scars of a life spent working with machinery. There was an honesty to those marks, an authenticity that could never be bought or simulated. Standing next to her, listening to the quiet breathing of the 1912 Case steam tractor inside the barn, I knew that the battle for this thunglung wasn't just about an easement or a driveway. It was a battle for the soul of the land itself. It was about whether we would live in a world of sterile beige and sand facades or a world of iron coal and honest labor. And as the brass whistle of the Case 110 echoed once more through the thunglung, carrying its deep resonant voice to the highest peaks of the Montana hills, I knew that we had won. The line had been drawn not by an HOA board or a county commissioner, but by the heavy bedrock of the nation itself. And we were standing on the right side of that line. Sing true. I whispered, my voice caught in the warm morning breeze. Valerie smiled, her fingers closing tightly around mine. Always, Wyatt, always.